Hello and welcome to Iowa Talking Points. I'm Jeff Stein from News Talk 1540 KXEL. Thank you for joining us for another in this series of conversations concerning issues of interest to Americans generally and Iowans in particular. Now, this program was produced in the afternoon of Friday, May 26, 2023, in front of a studio audience within Studio 5 at Mudd in Cedar Falls. And we welcome to Iowa Talking Points Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. Mr. Ramaswamy is a businessman, a New York Times best-selling author. He has 3 books to his credit: Woke Incorporated, Nation of Victims, and Capitalist Punishment. Very different book otherwise, Capitalist Punishment. He is an Ohio native. He is a graduate of Harvard and the Yale Law School. In 2022, he founded Strive, an Ohio-based asset management firm that directly competes with asset managers like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and others. Those entities, of course, use investor funds to promote agendas that many investors don't know about and with which they don't agree. He and his wife and their 2 sons live in Columbus, Ohio, and the campaign website is vivek2024.com. So once again, thank you for being along with us today. I appreciate it greatly. Now, the format of our program is very simple: a conversation about some of the key topics of interest to you, the voters. And today, I'll be joined in the questioning by Gentry Collins. Mr. Collins is CEO of the American Free Enterprise Chamber of Commerce, and by Rob Mudd, Chief Futurist at Mudd Advertising. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here and for inviting me to join this effort, which you all began and which has evolved into Iowa Talking Points. Now, to the members of our studio audience, if you have questions, jot them down on the cards we've provided. We'll pick those up midway through the conversation and ask your questions in the second half of the program. Include your first name if you would, and perhaps more importantly, write legibly. So let us begin the conversation with Mr. Ramaswamy. And you and I have had the opportunity to talk a few times on the radio before. Tell me about your background and what it is that led you to this point to be a presidential candidate at a quite young age.
That's right. I'm 37. I'm the first millennial to ever run for president, as you know, Jeff, as a Republican. But I'm in this because I want to pass on the American dream that I have lived to the next generation of Americans. And the way I lived that dream was taking on bureaucracies. So my career was not as a politician, never run for office before. It was in business. And one of the things I noticed in my career and my journey through American free market capitalism is when there's bureaucracy, there's opportunity. So the first bureaucracy that I encountered was that in big pharma. They think like a bunch of lemmings in that industry. And that's a good thing if you're willing to think differently. Why do they think that way? It's a regulated industry by the FDA. There's a lot of crony capitalism there. It's also a monopoly profit industry because of the patent system. That means they all go for the same projects at the same time, but that means they leave the same areas behind at the same time too. So I had a background in molecular biology. My parents gave us a focus on education growing up, and so I went to Harvard for college, as you mentioned. I studied biology. I put that science background to work, first by investing in biotech, but then starting a company that focused on the areas that big pharma had left behind. That resulted in 5 different medicines that my company worked on that are FDA-approved products today. One is a rare genetic disease in kids, where 100% of those kids die by the age of 3 if they're untreated. Now a majority of those kids live lives of normal duration if they're treated. Another one's a drug for prostate cancer and so on. That was my world. I stepped down as a biotech CEO in early 2021, right at the start of the year. After a series of events, since George Floyd died, there was a demand that I make a statement on behalf of Black Lives Matter in my capacity as a CEO. I refused to do it. I ended up facing a choice. So this is now a multi-billion-dollar company I've built from scratch. I'm leading it as CEO. And even then, I wasn't free to speak my mind as a citizen, or to the contrary, had to speak something that was other than what was actually on my mind or heart. So I decided to step aside from my job as CEO and take on a different bureaucracy, what I call the woke industrial complex. That's what that book, Woke Inc., was all about. Traveled the country, wrote Woke Inc. and the other books, calling out this cancer affecting companies across the country. But then I saw another opportunity. There's a bureaucracy in the ESG movement that's foisting these political agendas onto companies. And so there's one firm in particular, BlackRock, and others like them, like State Street and Vanguard, that are frankly using our money, many of your money, probably without your knowledge, your retirement funds, to vote for these political agendas in corporate America's boardrooms. Again, that's a bureaucracy. But that created an opportunity. So I started a company called Strive, as you mentioned, to challenge that bureaucracy by instead offering the same investment products, same kinds, but telling those companies to focus on profits and their products over politics and social agendas. We raised over $500 million in just the first 3 months after we launched our first fund, and it has grown since then. But you asked me what led to the doorstep of this journey, and if I'm being really honest about it, that trick of the woke industrial complex, that only works if we have a culture that's willing to buy up what they're selling. And I wasn't going to solve that through the market. I think to solve that, we need a national revival of our culture itself. And I think Reagan led us out of our last national identity crisis in the late 70s. I think we're in the middle of a national identity crisis today where people my age, I'm 37, as you said, really people any age, but certainly my age and younger, we're so hungry for a cause and for purpose and meaning and identity that we turn to these cheap tricks, go into Ben & Jerry's and ordering a cup of ice cream to satisfy our moral hunger, and then they put some social justice sprinkles on top. That doesn't satisfy our actual moral hunger. That's just fast food. We need the real thing. And so I'm in this race to answer what it means to be an American today, to drive a bottom-up cultural revival. And I think that that's something that, frankly, I looked in the mirror and said, we need to be better about, where I've been pointing out the problem. The analogy I use is the Israelites, right? When they escaped from the Pharaoh, this is the book of Exodus kind of stuff. What did they say when they're lost in the desert and don't see the promised land? They say they want to go back and be ruled by the Pharaoh. And so here I am pointing to the Pharaoh, right? The top-down forces of private power and state power foisting threats to our liberty. And there's real truth to that. But half the battle is we have to look within and ask ourselves, what is it that makes us want to bend the knee? And that's what I'd like to address, not just in this presidential campaign, but over the next 8 years of leading this country as Reagan did in 1980. I think we have an opportunity to do it in 2024. And that's what drew me into this race.
There are so many forces today that are aligned in opposition to what you just said. I mean, for example, most people assume that when they put money with a money manager or a fund, the goal is to maximize return on investment, and they are shocked to learn that there would be other factors at play. It is just seeping down into all forms of society. So how can you resurrect this so that your view of the American ideal is in concert with that of most of America, and that they stand up for it?
So that is the challenge ahead. And I told you that I built my career as a capitalist by taking on bureaucracy. Well, now I want to take on the biggest of those bureaucracies of all. That is the administrative state. That's really where a lot of the problem begins. The three-letter acronymous alphabet soup, FTC to FDA to SEC to God knows what, right? Sitting in Washington, D.C., the fourth branch of government that I view as fundamentally unconstitutional. So what's happened in this country is there's a waterfall of political accountability. The Constitution set into motion 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. We all learned that, or we thought we did. Well, they kicked that responsibility to the administrative state, the alphabet soup of, like I said, the TSA, FDA, FBI, and so on. Well, that alphabet soup is now kicking its responsibility even further down to the new alphabet soup: AMZN, MSFT, FB, GOOG. One of those, MSFT, Microsoft, is the owner of LinkedIn, the very platform that this week censored me as a U.S. presidential candidate. Think about that. From talking about climate change or Biden's relationships with China. So yes, these top-down forces are real, but the origin, I think the root cause of the problem, is that we have 3 branches of government, not 4 enshrined in the Constitution. but it's really the fourth branch that exercises all of the power today. So I'm running for president to be a president where the president who we elect to run the government will actually be the one who runs the government, rather than this managerial bureaucracy that runs the show. Thank you.
I have talked with office holders who themselves say, members of Congress who say, we gave too much authority away to these agencies. We abdicated our authority. They need to claw it back. That should just be enabling legislation. Why, if it is that simple, and I would agree with you it is, why does no one have the political will or strength to do it?
So Congress and the Senate, in theory, could do it, but they won't. Because, first of all, they're bodies designed to work slowly. Put aside even the partisan gridlock. Even if you had majorities, even if you had Republican majorities, it's not going to happen because it's naturally consensus-driven. And that's also why I think a professional politician or a career politician is not going to get this job done, because they're a product of the very system that created the problem in the first place. I think it takes an outsider.
This is the uniparty thing that people complain about, that the only thing that members of Congress have in mind or have in common is so that they each get reelected to remain part of the swamp.
I think that's correct. I don't mean to be harsh about it, but you said it exactly right. You're right over the target there. However, the next president can actually do it. Article 2 of the Constitution says the President of the United States runs the executive branch of the government. There's not two executive branches, there's one. And so what I say is that if I can't collect a paycheck from you all as the taxpayers for more than 8 years as the next president, which I think is a good thing, then neither will those federal bureaucrats who report into me either. Replace those civil service protections with 8-year term limits for the bureaucrats who were never elected. If you know what, and if there's a government agency that should have never existed in the first place, you don't just tinker around the edges. You have one answer, you shut it down. Take the U.S. Department of Education. Right, I give Trump credit for identifying it as a problem. Betsy DeVos is a great person to put on top of it. But they don't have the power to tinker around the edges. These tens of thousands of people were there long before, and guess what? They're now there long after, spending more money than they ever have, foisting radical racial and gender ideologies onto local schools. It's not just the school boards. It's coming from the federal government saying you don't get those funds unless you adopt those toxic ideologies. It starts with the bureaucracy. So I have said, as U.S. president, I'm the first to say it, I'm not going to promise to you to reform the Department of Education. That would be a false promise, because the president is viewed as a cute little inconvenience that comes and goes by the administrative state, the permanent state. If you want to take it on, you have to shut it down. And that's what I'll do to the Department of Education. It's actually what I've said I would do to the FBI. Think about it at the local level. You have on one hand, you have local police and you have local prosecutors. You don't have an investigative bureaucracy that sits in between. At the federal level, we have the U.S. Marshals and we have the Department of Justice. But when you have an intermediary agency that exists that had no unique purpose, they actually find things to do. That's the process for corruption. And that's the same FBI. It's not a partisan issue. That tried to threaten Martin Luther King Jr. into committing suicide, that now weaponizes its own police force against, say, President Trump. See the Durham Report's findings. Again, I cannot promise you to tame that beast. There are other presidential candidates who are talking, we're gonna fix the FBI and find the bad ones and fire them. It's not their fault, but it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how it works. I actually believe in the innate goodness of humanity, of the innate good in most human beings as individuals. But this bureaucracy is a monster unto itself, right? It's different than the individuals. It becomes its own machine, what Thomas Hobbes called the Leviathan. It is its own beast. And so there may be good people who come out of that and find honest work in the private sector or elsewhere once we let them go, and we will. But I can't promise to you to say that there's some one or two individual bad actors that we're going to root out. That is a false promise. It doesn't work that way. When the bureaucracy itself turns into its own animal, its own monster, you cannot tame the beast. You have to shut it down, restoring 3 branches of government as the Constitution envisioned, rather than 4. And I think here's why I'm I believe I'm going to be able to do it. Trump talked about the problem, but he didn't solve the problem. If he did, he wouldn't be under investigation by 5 different branches of the federal and branches and its extensions. In some ways, he's suffering because he didn't fix the problem. If you roll that log over, you better bring the pesticide, or else you better be eaten by what crawls out. I think you can go further. We can go further if we do it based on first principles and moral authority, not just vengeance and grievance. I think we will go further with the America First agenda than Donald Trump did, because this isn't about personal vengeance to me. This is about first principles. And the last president to do that in this country was Ronald Reagan. And if Ronald Reagan were alive and he were in this race, I wouldn't be. Because I wouldn't need to be. I'd just be behind him and help him in whatever way I could. But he's not. And I think that if we want to take that agenda to the next level on first principles, I was called into this race because I see a field. It's not even the presidential field. I'm not going to criticize anybody else. I'll criticize myself here. I've even been doing this for the last 3 years. Is we're running from something. I think we need to start running to something. What are we running to? What does it mean to be American? Right? We're running from race, gender, sexuality, climate. I've been running from these things. I've been criticizing the hypocrisies. That's gotten us so far, and there was a time and place for that, and we've done that. But now we need to run to a vision of our own. If the left gives you that vision of identity, race, gender, sexuality, climate, I'm running to our vision of what it means to be an individual, what it means to be a member of a family, not just against big government, but for the best known form of governance to mankind. That is the nuclear family. Running to the nation, running to God. God is not a 4-letter word. We should be able to talk about God in the open. The individual, the family, the nation, God. That is what we're running to. And I don't know about you all, but I don't hear our conservative movement talking about the destination. And that's what called me into this race. Ronald Reagan, he understood that. When he talks about the shining city on the hill, I think we still are that shining city on the hill. We can be if we choose to be. But that's not the choice we're making today. And so I will do my part for the next generation. I feel some responsibility as the young guy in this race. I'm told I'd be the youngest president ever if elected. That's great. I want to make those values cool again. Make family cool again. Make faith cool again. These aren't old-fashioned values that we're simply bringing back. If I may dare say it, these are progressive values that we're running to. We're making progress towards those. That's the message we're really taking not only to Republican audiences. I went to the south side of Chicago last week. Nearly all black audience, mostly poor, most of whom vote Democrat. Most of them, I think, left thinking they're going to support not me, but this vision of what we're running to, what it means to put all Americans first, is what I told them. America first is not just half the country first. It is all Americans first. We're going to college campuses that I'm encouraging my other presidential competitors, let's show up on the college campuses. Some of them say we have to pre-script the questions before they show up. I disagree with that. I'll go on NBC News. I'll go on CNN. Not because it's an even playing field, but because it's not, and someone has to show up. And I think the more we show up, the more we will be on the winning side. But that's going to require fortitude. It's going to require courage. It's going to require willingness to take risk. I think it's not something that the sport of politics produces all that often. Is risk-taking behavior is not something you get from politics, but capitalism rewards risk takers. And in a certain way, I think it's my experience as an outsider, my success in business, that teaches me that it's possible to take this on. This will be the biggest task of all. But for me, it's not about me. America First doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to Trump. It doesn't belong to DeSantis. It belongs to you, the people of this country. And if we're guided by our purpose, then I think nothing is going to stop us. If we're guided by faith, if we're guided by the humility that it is not being done by us, it is being done through us. When we see it that way, for me, it feels liberating for me to even say that to you just now. I don't feel like nobody's going to stop us when it's being done through us. And that's the way we're going to lead the country.
I want to involve my colleagues, but I want to first follow up on something you said about getting rid of some of these government agencies. There is the incestuous nature of Washington and that permanent ruling class that just nods as if you're just the temporary speed bump, whoever you happen to be. What about ripping it all apart, and instead of Washington, D.C., you have federal agencies across the entire country? Maybe the Department of Ag is in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Maybe the Treasury is in somewhere else, etc.
Oh, I love that. Of what remains, we will certainly distribute it across the country, right? That's the kind of redistribution I can get behind. Geographic redistribution of the remains of the administrative state. I think there's a double whammy here. You and I have talked about this in the past, Jeff. I quite like the idea. A, it's agencies that are more accountable to the people, but B, you know what? Half the people in Washington, D.C., the ones that we don't want to be part of the administrative state anyway, they won't be the ones moving. You avoid their severance costs that way. You save some money for the taxpayers and actually say that, hey, we didn't fire you. You just have to move to Ohio, where I'm from, or Iowa, or wherever else. They're not going to want to pack their bags and move. That's great. We save the severance costs, too. Give that back to the taxpayers. That's the way I look at it.
Gentry Collins of the American Free Enterprise Chamber of Commerce.
Welcome back to Iowa. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I just want to first thank you for the voice that you've already put into the public marketplace in terms of raising the alarm about woke capitalism and what it means. I think you speak very well about the importance of capturing the imagination of the next generation. I'd like to ask you to connect a couple of things. Sure. We work on American Free Enterprise on access for every business to the marketplace in America. And we highlight small and mid-sized businesses in this country, Vivek, as a force for human flourishing, right? That in one single American century, global human life expectancy more than doubled, right? We lose more of our poor now to diseases of excess than to diseases of deprivation for the first time in 6,000 years of recorded history, right? In other words, the American century was a powerful force for human flourishing, not just in America, but around the world. You talk about wanting to run back to the Pharaohs, and I think I love that. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about the Promised Land. Tell us, after 4 years of a Ramaswamy administration, what is life like for an American household here in Iowa or at home in Cincinnati, Ohio?
Love that question, Gentry. You're right. Capitalism is the best known system to mankind to lift people up from poverty, and we should not apologize for it. And taking on the administrative state, Jeff and I were talking about it in the context of restoring the integrity of a constitutional republic with 3 branches. But that administrative state is also the biggest threat to the economy. So that regulatory state, once you pare that back, that's the first step to unlocking economic growth. So 4 years in, where are we? We're growing at 4+% GDP growth again in America. We're at less than 1% this year. I think I'll get us back to over 4% in less than 4 years. You don't know how? First, we unleash American energy. Drill, frack, burn coal, embrace nuclear energy. That's GDP growth right there. And you know what? The EPA to the SEC that's using these carbon emission standards, I have an executive order already drafted, ready to go. We will roll back any mandate for even the measurement of carbon emissions in the economy. We're done with that game. We're done with the cult. That's unleashing American energy. Thank you. The second thing we do is we put people back to work. We have an epidemic of laziness fueled by the government that's not in the name of helping people is actually hurting people. Not only hurting our economy. Every business in this country will tell you the number one obstacle to growth of that business is hiring people. Mudd, right, where we're having this discussion. I mean, we talked about that this morning. It's true of any business. It's true of you. It's true of my businesses that I've started. That's the obstacle. Put people back to work by stopping paying them to stay at home. That's also what's contributing to our depression and anxiety epidemic. Depression and anxiety are up 2-fold in the last 3 years. People don't experience true joy and happiness when they sit at home, smoke pot, play video games, binge on television. That's not happiness. You get purpose from actually working and earned success. You nailed it. That is the path to true happiness, not just being handed your paper success, but to earn it. That means something. So that's the second point. And then the third point is reform of the Federal Reserve. I get a new chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve System in 2026. I will pick a chairman of the Federal Reserve who believes, as I do, in the stable dollar. That is the mandate for the Federal Reserve, not to play God, but to stabilize the U.S. dollar as a unit of measurement. That, too, is an input to GDP growth. Combine that with paring back the administrative state, we're well over 4+% GDP growth again in this country. It turns out people tend to love a country more when they're making more money in that country. And you make more money when you have your self-confidence back. So that's a virtuous cycle rather than the vicious victimhood, anti-growth, degrowth cycle we're in.
Growth underpins all of it, right? Growth solves those problems.
And I will not apologize for growth. The climate movement, it's really not about the climate. It is an anti-growth, degrowth agenda, because if it was about the climate, they'd be running to nuclear energy, the best known form of carbon-free energy production known to mankind. But stop for a second and wonder, why is it that the anti-carbon movement is also against the best known form of carbon-free energy production? It's because that has nothing to do with the climate. It has to do with letting the rest of the world catch up by taming our own growth rates. Nuclear energy might be too good from a growth perspective at solving their own problem. That's why they're against that, because it had nothing to do with the climate and everything to do with apologizing for growth and success and achieving the ends instead of global equity. I refuse to play that game.
Let me ask you one follow-up, and I'll turn it back over to you. You talked about your status as the first millennial, and God bless you. We need more of you. One of the things that we face at American Free Enterprise Chamber is this idea that we're losing a generational battle. Yes. That the younger generation, and the younger you get in the younger generations, although I mean people that have aged into the electorate already, so 18 and up, that the younger we get, the less support there is for American free enterprise, for American capitalism, the less understanding there is of the power of those ideas. How do you say to a 22-year-old, now a full generation behind you, how do you say to a 22-year-old that here's what 4% growth means in your life? Here's how your life is better because President Ramaswamy drove 4% growth?
I think you do it through actions and not words. So my generation, why we became jaded with respect to capitalism is, so I got my first job in the fall of 2007 in New York City on the eve of the 2008 financial crisis. That was an interesting experience in the finance industry, but it's okay. I mean, I didn't grow up from money. You know, this is great learning experiences for me for all I could care. And, you know, I actually ended up finding opportunity on the other side of that, helped me achieve success. And that was great for me. My parents always taught me that hardship is not the same thing as victimhood. Right? Hardship is what teaches you who you really are. And if you learn that, then your eyes are open to finding opportunity. That being said, though, many of my peers didn't have the same good fortune that I did, and I think became jaded in a system where you were taught that a 4-year college education would get you ahead. Turns out it didn't. It left you with debt instead. You were taught that your own hard work gets you instead. Well, you get the 2008 financial crisis and then bailouts on the back of it, which, by the way, was a Republican policy back then. I was dead set against it then. I'm dead set against it now. So I think that's an understandable. I'm not justifying it. I think most millennials embrace the wrong attitudes towards America and towards capitalism, but you have to understand where it comes from. That's part of where it comes from. If we're delivering 4+% GDP growth, I don't need to explain it. They're going to be experiencing it, right? Seeing their peers who take risks and succeed to understand that those who work hard are the ones who get ahead. Actions speak louder than words. That's how we reach the next generation. And the way I talk about it isn't in a scolding manner. I don't think scolding much works. I do think that we have to revive civic education in the country. I do think that young people need to know something about the country that they're voting to be a part of. There was a survey that came out last week. It said 60% of young Americans would sooner give up their right to vote than they would give up TikTok. Think about that. I mean, this is what we're working with. So we're going to have to think ambitiously of how we revive civic pride in this country. I do think economic growth and showing people that there's a path to say that we do have equality of opportunity, that you're able to get ahead no matter your skin color or who you are. That's the America I know. That's the America I've lived. Once they start living that America too, they come around. But we're going to have to be ambitious about reviving that civic pride. And I can answer in some of the other questions. We've launched ambitious proposals in this campaign of how we're going to do it, some of which are controversial. That's okay. Whatever the path is that we're on, it's not going to be what gets us there. But reviving that civic identity for the next generation, that's my responsibility. If I'm the first millennial ever elected, if I'm the youngest president in history, I'm the first millennial already running for the GOP nomination, that is my responsibility. And I take that seriously. if you vest me with that trust and that responsibility to reach the next generation, if there's one thing I deliver, it will be national pride for the next generation that now currently lacks it.
Next question's from Rob Mudd of Mudd Advertising.
Vivek, thank you for being here on the Mudd campus. The automotive space is very important to my family's business because that's what we do, work with car dealers. A couple years back, I was fortunate to go to China and experience the car industry over there. And one of the fellows I was traveling with, I asked, because of the electrification, I said, Peng, how do the Chinese, how do they create their energy? Oh, they burn coal.
Yes, they do.
I said, what? They burn black coal so that they can create energy or electricity so that the car emissions don't pollute the skies, right? Well, so to your point, it's not about the environment. It's about right? So my dad once taught his kids, and still does today, if you don't stand for something, you fall for everything. How do you stand against China?
So I think first we have to stand against the tricks they play back against us here at home. They're exploiting our own insecurities about ourselves, yet laugh at us as we do it. There's even a word, a Chinese word. Baizuo is the word. Refers to literally, translated, progressive or woke white people in the United States who are insecure about their identity. And they use it to laugh at us because they understand that, Xi Jinping, when he's pressed by the UN on the Xinjiang crisis, where there's over 1 million religious minorities enslaved in concentration camps, subject to forced sterilization, communist indoctrination, and worse. This has been documented by the German journalist Adrian Zenz. I wrote about it in Woke Inc. The first thing Xi Jinping says when he's pressed by that is that the U.S. is no better because of Black Lives Matter, and see what they say. So they're using our own insecurities back against us. Their top diplomat came to the Alaska summit, sat across from our Secretary of State, Blinken, and said that the U.S. needs to do better on human rights and that they want to see the U.S. stop slaughtering, that's their actual word, slaughtering black Americans. So we're falling for those tricks. Take the electric vehicle movement. It's a farce, right? We indulge this. I just tweeted it this morning. End electric vehicle subsidies in this country. If they're so good, fine. Let consumers buy them. But we're not going to subsidize it, right, in this country. And so the first thing we do, we have to unshackle ourselves from those insecurities. The second thing we do, and this is unfortunately because I think people can mostly empower themselves, but unfortunately this one's a job for the U.S. president, is we need to stand up with the spine across the table from Xi Jinping and say we will no longer depend on our enemy for our modern way of life. Declare independence from communist China. You will not buy land in this country if you're affiliated with the CCP. You will not donate to universities in this country and co-opt them if you're affiliated with the CCP. We will hold you accountable with every lever we have available, including financial levers for unleashing hell on the world with the COVID-19 pandemic. We will not apologize for these things. That is what it means to stand up.
So we have the fentanyl on our southern border.
From China.
From China, which is payback for the opium wars, right?
Right.
You have TikTok, which you mentioned earlier, which is ruining our children's brains.
Digital
right?
fentanyl.
Absolutely, digital fentanyl. And then you have the ability for the Chinese to send 300,000 of their kids into the United States every year to get an education from our best universities. Why are we so blind to the realities of what's taking place? And how do you think you can fix that?
Well, I'm going to use a play on words here, but it's the truth. Because you brought up the fentanyl analogy, it makes me think of what's actually going on. We're addicted. We're not just addicted to the fentanyl or the digital fentanyl or the financial fentanyl in the form of the national debt. We're addicted to China. And that's the bluff that Xi Jinping is calling on us. You don't have it in you to wean yourself off of me. Because you guys are too addicted to tomorrow, to the stuff. Right? They don't think of themselves as capitalists. They think of themselves as laughing at us. You guys are a bunch of capitalist addicted, short-termists who can't do what's right for you on the time scales of history because you're thinking on the time scales of tomorrow. So just try me. That's what Xi Jinping's saying. You have to understand what that other side looks like. I've been an exchange student in China for 2 years during my years in college. My first business, I actually did business in China. We had a subsidiary in China. When I started Strive, we made a commitment that we would never do business in China because you can't be a good fiduciary to U.S. clients if you have the boot of the CCP on your neck. So that's what they're calling our bluff. Now it's up to us. The ball's in our court. Can you actually find the fortitude to make some short-run sacrifice to actually do what's right for the long run? Do we have it in us? That's the question. It's not a question for Xi Jinping. That's a question for us. But I think we can make that sacrifice. Short run. It's not much. Short-run inconveniences, if we know what we're sacrificing for.
This morning you made mention of U.S. companies going to do business in China. And so when I was over there, I learned the fact that any U.S. company going there has to become a partner with the CCP.
Yes.
And the CCP owns 51%, the U.S. company 49%. What do you do with compromised OEMs, manufacturers, General Motors, Ford? What's the answer to those big conglomerates that are doing business in China?
So I think we need to look. Whether Trump leaving the Pacific Trade Partnership, et cetera, we could debate the merits of it. I can understand where he was coming from, but that actually gives us leverage now to go back, and now it's like a evolved version, the OPTPP. It's a new evolved version of that. To say that if we're serious about declaring independence from China, we can tap Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam. Let's even go further around, Brazil, Mexico, and so on. To say that we're not automatically, and I don't believe in making false promises. I would love to tell you we're going to immediately onshore all that to the United States. That ain't going to happen. Study the facts. I would love for it to happen. It's not going to happen. Not instantly. But if you're willing to actually engage with both onshoring to the U.S. and a full network of non-Chinese partners to fill that supply chain void, that becomes much more achievable, right? And so we can't conflate the two things. So when I say we're declaring independence from China, I mean it. We're going to do it. We're going to do it in a way that's minimally disruptive or harmful if we're actually willing to use allied nations, the full set that I described and more, to be able to fill the gap. Then it actually becomes far more achievable, far more, frankly, sustainable for the United States over the long run. So that's how we do it.
Very good.
We are a little more than midway through this Iowa Talking Points conversation with Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy, author of Woke Incorporated, Nation of Victims, and the new book, Capitalist Punishment. We're going to take a short break so we can collect those audience questions, and we'll be back in about 2 minutes. Welcome back to Iowa Talking Points. I'm Jeff Stein from News Talk 1540 KXEL. In today's edition of the program, which was produced on Friday, May 26, 2023, we're in conversation with businessman and Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. And we'll start this portion of our program by introducing questions from our audience here within Studio 5 at Mudd in Cedar Falls. And as you can tell, we have quite a lot. So I'm going to, we'll see if this is like a lightning round. John wants to know, what is your angle of attack to end the corruption in the FBI and Justice Department? Obviously, you're talking about getting rid of some things, but in terms of creating the right climate.
So I think that A, we have to shut down the FBI. B, we have to rectify some of the things that have gone wrong. The asymmetric standards of prosecution, we have to end it. So if somebody was convicted of a crime and is sentenced, for other people who are not prosecuted regularly under those same standards, that's a basis for a pardon. I think that actually at least sets the level playing field. When there are government actors who themselves have become rogue actors, acted illegally, they deserve to be held accountable to the fullest extent under the law. That begins to restore something we've lost in the country, our rule of law itself. And I'll make a quick comment. There's 3 things that have happened in recent weeks that you might think are unrelated, right? I'm just watching the news. You got the Durham report coming out. You've got 14,000 migrants now illegally crossing the southern border. You have that incident with Jonathan Neely and Sergeant Daniel Penny, who, whose legal defense I'm supporting financially. Those seem to have nothing to do with each other. Actually, they do. They're all symptoms of the abandonment of the rule of law in America. And when the top law enforcement agencies from the FBI to the DOJ abandon the rule of law, how on earth could we expect migrants on the other side of the southern border or criminals in our cities to respect the rule of law either? That's something we'll do, is restore the culture of the rule of law in America. And I think that's the responsibility of the next president to do it, and I take that seriously.
Bob wants to know, or writes, first of all, I like that you recognize China as the enemy of capitalism and the USA. How will you support Taiwan?
Excellent question. We need to make sure Taiwan stays independent. This is different from Ukraine. I would not give another dollar of aid to Ukraine. That does not directly relate to American interests at all. And I don't apologize for that position. But Taiwan, we're dependent on them for our modern way of life because the little chips that power our phones or the refrigerators that keep our water cold, we depend on that small, tiny island nation off the southeast coast of China. I don't want to go to war. So I'm thinking about creative ways to do it. One of the things I said to the NRA at the speech I gave earlier this year is, let's export our ideas, the Second Amendment. Let's export that. Put a gun in every Taiwanese household. Train them how to use it. Xi Jinping will think twice before he invades that island, okay? So I think that there's a lot that we can do. Shore up our own semiconductor self-sufficiency in this country. That decreases the incentive for him to go for Taiwan and reduces the risk to us if he does. That's how we need to be thinking. That's the America First way.
Craig writes and asks, what is your plan to balance the federal budget?
Economic growth, full stop. And I laid out my growth plan, unshackle energy, put people back to work, reform the Fed. If we're at 4+% GDP growth, our fiscal problems melt away. I'm not playing small ball. Democrats talk about tax increases, other Republicans bring bifocal spectacles and talk about spending cuts. GDP growth is our path forward, and I'm going to deliver it.
Kelly wants to know, what can you offer that President Trump cannot?
Well, I'm closer to Trump in 2015 than Trump today is to Trump in 2015. I will not be the same person 8 years from now that I am today. And Trump is not the same person today that he was 8 years ago. It's the reality. You try to drain the swamp drains you. We're human beings. So I respect what he did, but I'm building on that foundation to go further. I've got fresh legs. I'm the outsider in this race. 8 years from now, I'll be tired, jaded, cynical, a few extra pounds and fewer hairs. But that's reality. We're human, and I think that I'm the outsider with fresh legs in this race.
How will you handle all of the illegal aliens who have invaded our great nation? This question comes from Beth.
So I'll tell you how I look at it. I don't even blame them. Really honest. We're human beings. Let's put ourselves in their shoes. If you have an administration that says you have an open border with a wink and a nod, maybe we'd be doing the same thing. I blame the corrupt administration. However, because I told you, thank you, I believe in the rule of law. And as difficult as it is, we cannot abandon the rule of law. Amnesty is not an option. We will, as humanely and respectfully and decently as possible, take people back to where they came from and give people who have demonstrated themselves to be law-abiding citizens who can make a contribution a chance to take the time to enter legally if they're willing to make contributions. That's the way it goes.
Excellent questions from our audience here at Studio 5 at Mudd. Unsigned question, what is your position on abortion? And I assume that's broader,
yes.
The life issue.
I'm unapologetically pro-life. I picked that up at St. X High School. Thank you. And I think that more of us are pro-life in this country than will admit it. Clarence Thomas brought it up. I think Dobbs correctly overturned Roe, but he brought it up. If there's a pregnant woman walking down the street and somebody assaults her and the unborn child dies as a result, you find me somebody who says in this country that that person doesn't deserve to be held criminally liable. You won't. It means most of us share pro-life instincts. So it's not a women's rights versus men's rights issue. It's a human rights issue, and we need to treat it accordingly.
James asks about your thoughts on ethanol.
So I believe in consumer choice. Full stop. Give consumers the choice. Same thing I said about electric vehicles. No special subsidies to oil companies, no special subsidies to electric vehicles, no special subsidies to anybody. Leave it to consumers. Let consumers make the choice, and I have confidence that ethanol will play a role in that marketplace.
This is from Steve. He says, many of your talking points should be appealing to people on both sides of the aisle, so how do you propose to reach those Democrats and independents in a general election?
One of the things you might notice is I haven't mentioned the word Republican once, and I rarely do. Probably in the 3 events we've done all day today here in Cedar Falls, we haven't mentioned Republicans or Democrats once. Because that's, I don't even think, the real dividing line in our country. The real dividing line in our country is between the managerial class and the everyday citizen. Between those of us who are pro-American, standing for the ideals of this country, and then those that exist in this country who are anti-American, who wish to apologize for a nation founded on those ideals. That's the way I see it. That's the way I talk. And so when I think we divide it up that way, it's not 50-50 anymore. It's easily 80-20 in our favor. And half the 20 are people younger than me who never learned what those ideals were in the first place. They'll come along if we teach them to them. So that's why I think that, look, if I'm the nominee, you hold me to this standard, we will deliver a landslide election like Reagan did in 1980. That sounds about as ridiculous for me to say as today as it would have for Reagan to say in 1979. But I think we can do it. I think we're going to do it. If you guys do your part, I promise you I'll do mine. That's why I'm in this race.
We have a few more questions from the audience, which I'll come back to, but Rob Mudd takes the conversation forward now.
So, Vivek, I'm pretty focused on this China invasion. I think that obviously the CCP are Marxists. What is it that you will do? They have a book. It's called the 100-Year Marathon. And in the book, it lays out the plan of how they're going to overcome the West. What is it that you, and I know you answered a little bit ago, but it's deeper than that, right? It's deeper than that. What is the stance that the U.S. should be taking currently with China, full stop, whether it be, I'll just leave it at that.
Defeat them economically so that we never have to militarily. And we do that by ending the codependent relationship. It's like human relationships. Codependent relationships do not end well. The only question is who ends it first. The sooner we end it, the better for us. The longer we wait, the better for them. You know, we got into this habit 50 years ago in this country of exporting Big Macs and Happy Meals and somehow thinking that was going to spread democracy to places like China. We thought we could use our money to get them to be more like us.
Does
AI flip that on its head?
Does AI scare you with where it is today?
I think AI does present risks akin to what gain-of-function research presented as supposedly a form of research to prevent a global pandemic. Guess what? Created a global pandemic. But here's a lesson to learn from that. We banned gain-of-function research in this country. Now, rogue government officials, including Anthony Fauci, paid for that to take place in other places like a lab in Wuhan, China, where that began, and then censored us from saying so for 3 years. Now we know the truth. I view an analogy, at least a lesson learned with AI, where even if we're managing some of those risks here, some Elon Musk and others have called for a voluntary pause on AI. That's too soft in some sense, because if we're doing that here, it doesn't matter if China's doing the same thing over there. And guess what? We banned gain-of-function research here. Well, it came back in the form of gain-of-function research conducted in China, shamefully funded by rogue U.S. government actors. So my view is there are certain risks to AI that we need to take seriously. But we're not going to constrain ourselves until we lead the way in applying those same constraints to other parts of the world, including and especially China, using a nuclear non-proliferation framework and compliance system for actually making sure that we're delivering that. And I'm not trusting the UN to do it. That has to be led by the U.S.
Gentry Collins.
Vivek, I want to turn your attention to the administrative state. You know, we talk a lot about Congress. We talk a lot about the relationship between the president and the Congress. One of the things that I think is shocking to people when they first hear it is just how pronounced the growth in the regulatory state has been. So I think about in 1996, I'll claim that's the last time the two major parties agreed that we had too much federal government, right? That's Bill Clinton saying the era of big government is over. I went back and I looked, there were 9,200 federal rules on the books the day that he said the era of big government is over in 1996. 9,200 federal rules. Since then, there's not been a single year, Republican or Democratic president, with fewer than 3,000 new additional final rules that have been added to the register. Today, the total count approaches 120,000 federal rules with the force of law. How does your administration start to wind that back in a meaningful and sustainable way?
Well, first of all, there's this doctrine called the Chevron doctrine, which says that you defer to those rules.
In front of the courts.
In front of the courts.
Today,
in front of the federal courts. It's in front of the court today, too. Regardless, I will run the executive branch accordingly, saying that we don't, as the executive branch that supposedly promulgated those rules, do not believe these rules actually bear deference to statutes. Most of those rules actually are unconstitutional because they didn't relate to the statutes that supposedly authorize them. That's what West Virginia versus EPA was all about. And so I'm actually going to do something that usually it's the executive branch pushing for the validity of these rules. I'm actually going to do something different. We're going to direct the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney General to post West Virginia versus EPA identify all of the unconstitutional rules and roll them back. It's actually usually in front of the Supreme Court, it's the executive branch arguing in favor of keeping the rule. We're wearing the other hat. And I think that makes it a lot easier to roll that back. So, again, I believe at its core, the administrative state is fundamentally unconstitutional. Our founding fathers would be rolling over in their graves, I'm sure they are, knowing that there's now a fourth branch of government that operates outside of the system of checks and balances that they ordained. And it's also a threat to federalism itself, too.
Yes, it is.
Because they're impeding on the states. There's one answer when it shouldn't have existed. You shut it down. That is what we're going to do.
Amen.
Thank you.
A couple of more questions from the audience, then we'll have time for you to deliver closing remarks to these folks. You've touched on this a bit, but the question is a little broader, so I want to give you the opportunity. How will you protect the sovereignty of the USA, and what will that look like at the border? I presume that's the southern border, although we have a porous northern border now too.
Yes, true.
And with respect to China, Iran, and North Korea.
Well, that tacked on a lot there at the end. Well, let me talk about my foreign policy prioritization then, because that actually addresses the first question. My top foreign policy priority is protecting Americans here on American soil. And rather than using our military to protect somebody else's border in God knows where, we will use our own military to protect our own southern and northern border. That is a constitutional, legally and ethically justified use of the military to actually close the holes in the Swiss cheese of a southern border that we have today. I will not apologize for that. Thank you. And that is how we end the fentanyl crisis in the country as well.
Yeah.
So now imagine the U.S. military is actually solving a crisis that's responsible for 200 deaths per year here on American soil of Americans here at home. More deaths per year than the number of people, 50 times the number of people who died on 9/11. Now say the military is actually doing that. Now that's a source of national pride. We're actually using our military not to fight some vaguely defined other hemisphere conflict, but rather actually saving American lives here at home through securing our own border. That's a source of national pride. I believe we'll go from 25% recruitment deficits like we have in our military today to over-enrollment because young people can be proud of serving a military that actually has a purpose in this country rather than one that's just going through the motions because of the bureaucratic class sitting at the Pentagon. That's the way I see it.
Final question from the audience, and it comes from Shane, and it is a two-part question. What is the biggest issue facing the United States, first domestically, and then from a foreign perspective?
I'm tempted to answer with the same for both. Same answer for both. It is the loss of our national self-confidence. See, when we're weak, we can't stand up on the global stage when we doubt ourselves. It's that policy of doubt that causes us to buckle on the global stage across the table from Xi Jinping, across the table from other leaders around the world. Yet that's our same problem here at home as well. It's our lack of self-confidence that leads us to embrace victimhood narratives rather than the victor mentality required to have a thriving economy. So in a certain sense, that's why the whole campaign here, my campaign, is about reviving our missing national identity, answering what it means to be an American today. Answer that question, our foreign policy challenges melt away. Answer that question, our economic challenges melt away. It's not that I don't care. Some people hear me talk a lot about our national character. Wonder, oh, you don't care about kitchen table issues or foreign policy? No, I do. But I want to go upstream to the root cause, which is our loss of self-confidence itself. Self-confidence as a nation. Self-confidence as individuals. Once we get back that spine to stand up for who we are without apologizing for it, then you know what? Our economic challenges and our foreign policy challenges automatically becomes that ones that we will conquer at once simultaneously. And that's what I'm leading us to.
Well, we are close to the end of our time, so we'll give you the last 2 minutes or so to make your case to these and other Iowa voters.
Thank you. Look, we've talked a lot about the problems, but I want to share with you my conviction that we are not a nation in decline. We're not ancient Rome. We're not Carthage. I think we're just a little young, actually. Going through our own version of adolescence. Figuring out who we're really going to be when we grow up. When you view it that way, it makes sense, right? When you go through adolescence, you doubt who you are. You go through self-doubt. You go through an identity crisis. We all did growing up. Well, I think that's what we're going through as a nation. And when you see it that way, it just becomes obvious that our best days are actually, truly, not in some cheesy politician kind of way, but just in a true way, actually ahead of us. We're not in decline. I think we probably are in our ascent, the early stages of our ascent. I don't even think we've hit base camp yet. That's where I think we are in our journey, right? Rome even lasted for 1,000 years, 2,000 if you count the second half of the Eastern Roman Empire. We're early in our days as a country, but it's not going to happen automatically. It's going to happen because we choose it to be so. It's going to happen because we start talking openly again. We close that gap between what people are willing to say in private and what they're willing to say in public. That's the true health of a country. And if we make that choice to exhibit not fear but courage in our own right, it's not going to be a president that comes down from on high and saves us. I have a role to play. But I'm not letting you off the hook either, okay? It's going to take all of us. If we're going to be saved, it is going to be because we save ourselves together. And if we do it, then we pass on a country to the next generation where we can still look our kids in the eye and say in good conscience that, first of all, you know what, whoever is in that White House, I do want you to grow up and be like him, to say that without holding your nose. And to say it honestly, that we are still the country where no matter who you are or where your parents came from or what your skin color is, that you can still achieve whatever you want in this country with your own hard work, your own commitment, and your own dedication, and that, you know what, you're free to speak your mind at every step of the way too. That is the new American dream. That is the American dream that we lived. That is the American dream that we will pass on to our kids. And if you all do your part, I promise you I will do mine. And I thank you for hearing me out today, and I look forward to being here in Iowa. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well done. Thanks for being here. That was awesome. Thank you.
Well, that brings to a close this edition of Iowa Talking Points, featuring a conversation with Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. More at their campaign website, vivek2024.com. A reminder, today's program was produced on Friday, May 26th within Studio 5 at Mudd in Cedar Falls. Thanks to our panelists, Gentry Collins, CEO of the American Free Enterprise Chamber of Commerce, and Rob Mudd, Chief Futurist at Mudd Advertising. Go to iowatalkingpoints.com for more information on future events, which will be live streamed and available via video on demand at iowatalkingpoints.tv and aired on News Talk 1540 KXEL. I'm Jeff Stein. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Iowa Talking Points.
Thank you, Jeff. Really appreciate it.